We're really excited about the talk today. This is the second of our two CARLA Fellows, Corey Matthew, who's going to be presenting. And she is a PhD student in the Second Language Education Program in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. And she is interested in immersion education in secondary contexts, and that's what she's going to be talking to us about today. The title of her talk is Materials Design and Use in a Secondary Spanish Immersion Classroom. So please welcome Corey.
Thanks, Kate, and I'd like to thank Kate and everyone at CARLA for choosing me as a fellow this year. It's been really a great impetus for me to come to other CARLA talks and to get more involved, and I was very honored to be chosen. And thank you all so much for coming to my presentation. I'll be talking today about some of the work and thinking I've been doing really over the past 2 years, looking at materials in different ways in secondary immersion contexts. And so I want to start this presentation just with the important acknowledgement that materials really are a ubiquitous aspect of most secondary classrooms, and materials design and development is a thriving business. However, despite the prominence of materials in the classrooms and the vast industry of materials publication, the work of materials development itself is really rarely informed by classroom-based materials use research. And so this materials development process progresses with very little input and knowledge of what teachers actually do with materials in the classroom. And this is where materials use research, like I do, comes into play. It's important that we define materials because they're defined in many different ways in different studies. For the purpose of today's talk, I'm calling materials text-based or print-based artifacts that are used during instructional time. And so I'm talking about textbooks, ancillary materials, teacher-made worksheets or handouts, and teacher-created PowerPoint presentations for today's talk. And today I have 3 main goals for this talk. I first will very briefly set the scene of materials use research and language learning in general. And then I want to talk very briefly about materials use in DLI, or dual language and immersion contexts in particular, and some of the unique challenges that we face in those contexts. And then for the majority of the talk, I'm going to focus in on some of the work I've been doing this year, thinking a little bit more theoretically about what a design of material is, and then how those materials are mobilized in a classroom. And so to begin with that, the research on materials use in language classrooms in general seeks to understand what actually happens with materials in the classrooms. And I've identified 4 separate strands of what this type of research looks like. These strands overlap, they're not distinct, but it helps me sort of categorize how this research is taken up. And so the vast majority of this research looks at the adaptation or modification of materials before they're used in the classroom and while they're in use in the classroom. A second strand will look at materials as components of a classroom ecology, using a classroom ecology perspective to say, how do these materials function as ecological structures within this space? A third strand looks at materials as mediating objects and interaction. And so this research gets a little bit more micro, looking directly within the discourse and how are materials used to mediate this discourse. And then the fourth strand will look at materials as artifacts that can be interpreted and appropriated by teachers and students. And I should say appropriated or rejected, of course, by teachers and students. And so even though all 4 of these categories looks at materials used from different perspectives, there are some trends that can be seen across the 4 in their results. And first of all, it's clear that the materials offer a variety of affordances and constraints that can be taken up or rejected or ignored by the teachers and students in the classroom. And then also, some of these studies have shown that materials can be or represent a social actor with a will and a voice within that classroom space. And then the third important trend is the role of materials in the formal, the desired, and the enacted curriculum of a classroom. And so if we're talking about these 3 different types of curricula, the formal curricula is generally defined as that which exists in the materials themselves, especially if we're talking about a textbook curriculum or within a scope and sequence of lesson plans. It's more materials-based. And then the desired curriculum is when the teacher starts to engage with materials, and what does the teacher intend to do within their lessons, within their classroom. And then, of course, the enacted curriculum is when we throw those students, teachers, and materials all together in that classroom ecology and what actually happens in that space. And Tudor writes about these aspects of curriculum, Ian Tudor, discussing the messiness between these ideas of statement of intent or desired curriculum and then the curriculum as reality. And we know, of course, that this enacted curriculum very rarely corresponds to either the desired or the formal curriculum that occurred before. And this is really unsurprising to any teacher, and yet it's an important finding that led me to wonder more deeply about what's going on here. What components of this formal curriculum, or really the design of these materials, relate to the enacted material, or the enacted curriculum, excuse me, how those materials are being taken up by the teachers and students. And that's the question that I'll be returning to later, really trying to find that messiness between the formal or designed curriculum of the materials and the enacted, the mobilization. Before I get there, though, I want to talk about materials in DLI in particular, because that's the context that I'm working in. And it's important to remember that those studies I cited at the beginning, most if not all of them, were occurring in more traditional language learning classrooms. And so they're talking about materials that are designed to facilitate language acquisition or language learning in some way. Materials in a DLI context are often content materials. And so they're materials that are designed to engender learning of social studies or science or language arts. And so the materials that we're talking about look something more like this, right? We'll see a textbook page that has social studies text at the top and a map at the bottom. So this is focusing students in on Africa. And it's okay that you can't read it. We'll get to more deeply into some of the materials later. We also see materials that maybe look like this, a table where students are asked to come up with different characteristics of 3 African countries. There's language that happens here, of course, and language that students need, but the material itself is not designed to instigate language learning. We also see PowerPoints that maybe look like this, presenting information on Ghana, but the information itself is all, or the material itself is designed to present information, not to be focusing on language learning in any way. And so when we're thinking about materials in DLI context, we know that it's very hard for teachers to find and utilize appropriate materials for this type of content-based instruction. There are a couple reasons for this that have been identified in the literature. First, these materials really do have a dual function of having to support academic achievement while also fostering the second language development, since those are 2 of the 3 main goals of DLI education. Even more so at the secondary level, we start to be finding more complex academic content within these materials that's going to require advanced academic language. And so the materials, if they're at the correct academic level, may have language that's more complex than what the students can actually access with the proficiency that they're developing in our DLI programs. And that ties into the third point that some researchers have shown that authentic literature and textbooks can be too linguistically demanding for these students. And so teachers are often modifying materials or adapting them to be appropriate for their students. So in general, to summarize this, these secondary immersion materials need to be designed to be cognitively and linguistically accessible to these students, which is a tough thing to balance. Other studies by Fortune, Tedek, and Walker, and Tedek and Camarada have reported that immersion teachers in the US often cite the lack of appropriate materials in the target language as an impediment to their instruction. And so this led into the first study that I did that I'll talk about very, very briefly, but where I was looking, exploring into the idea of the classroom ecology and what roles materials play in the secondary classroom ecology. And so for this study, I collected data in a 7th grade Spanish immersion classroom, and I audio recorded and observed 14 lessons, which for this class, because they were double periods, was the first lesson all the way to the last lesson of a unit on Africa. And what I found after I analyzed and looked through my data is that, in general, the design of the materials in this classroom, in conjunction with how they were positioned and used by the teacher, strongly impacted the instructional paradigm. And so in this space, I use the phrase one correct answer paradigm, where the materials were using many display comprehension questions or inviting these questions, which communicate to the students that they only needed to respond with one correct answer. And then along with this instructional paradigm in turn affected the type of discourse that students were producing, limiting opportunities for their language development. And so here I immediately saw a bit of a red flag that caused me to think a little bit more about how might immersion materials be designed to better integrate content and language, but better also engender or foster a focus on content and language in the classroom. And essentially, I found that simply using content materials that are translated into Spanish is not enough to support effective DLI pedagogy that will integrate content and language. And so when I was thinking about, okay, if I want to design or do future design modifications to these materials, it might help me to first think about what are the natures and components of the designs of these materials and how is that impacting how they're being used before I go ahead and try to change them. And that leads into to what I'll talk about today. And so I did some thinking into design and theories around materials design. And I really was inspired by Vygotsky's notion of the human-tool relationship and thinking about pedagogical materials as tools. And Vygotsky doesn't quite make that connection as strongly, talking about classroom materials per se. But I found some other researchers who do, and I found it to be very compelling. And so Vygotsky is arguing that human activity involves mediated action or the use of tools by human agents to interact with one another and with the world. And so each of these tools has a unique form or nature that's purposely designed with a specific function in mind, right? And the objects or these tools will signal their intended uses by the perceptual cues that is built into them and how they're designed. And so when I talk about the design of a material, I'm really thinking about the form of the material and what cues are sent or invited by that design that can be taken up by the human actor. And so to give you some ideas of what I'm talking about here, if I show you this image on the screen, I assume that you all have some sense of what this is and how it should be used. We're all within education, so we know it's a Venn diagram, right? And the two circles that overlap, for us, cue that we'll be comparing or contrasting something. If this was put in front of us, we would know how to use it. And so here we have a mixture of what Ott refers to as the objective design. The two circles are an objective design, but there's also a subjective scheme, which is what we understand and interpret within the material itself. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Another example is a PowerPoint slide here that we recognize as a PowerPoint slide, and the bullet points already cue to us certain ways that we should interact with this slide. Maybe we're going to be copying down these bullet points if that's the subjective scheme within our classroom. But one way or another, we already know we need to read. And even if you don't speak Spanish, you probably already have a sense of how you need to interact with this material in some way. And so I already mentioned the subjectively given structure of the material, what we can see on the material, as well as the subjective scheme, which is the tradition, the meanings, and expectations that mediate how we're going to interpret the objective structure that we can see in the material itself. So Brown has done some writing that really helped me think about this, and he talks about the objective structure, and I'll use the term design from here on out, is the objective structure of pedagogical materials having three main components. And so they'll have representation of tasks on the material, and so that might be instructions, it might be procedures, it might be prompts. I would argue even questions on the material are a representation of a task. They have representations of concepts and conceptual relationships, and so these are the textual descriptions, graphs. And Brown even argues the way that information is sequenced in a material is a conceptual relationship of how we're supposed to then understand that information and be thinking about it. And then finally, you can have physical objects, the materials themselves, or representations of objects. I don't see that much in my materials, but for example, if a material told a student to go look at a globe, the material itself is not the globe, but it's a representation of that object that the student needs to do something with. So there are three other key points about these materials themselves, and as I already mentioned, that materials can offer affordances or constraints that will then mediate the human interaction with the material, right? It's also important to keep in mind that the human interpretation is a key component of this. The material itself is an inert object. It doesn't mean anything if it's locked away in a closet. It means something once the human comes in and interprets and interacts with it. And then finally, that the design itself reflects the social and ideological views of knowledge and how knowledge is learned. And so these materials are always placed within the sociohistoric context one, in which they were created, and two, in which they are used. And that's going to affect both the design and how that design is interpreted. And so in general, to summarize kind of everything I've been getting at here, Remillard writes that the form of a material is going to denote certain meanings to the reading, or a zone of expectation. And then that form and that zone of expectation will influence how teachers will then engage with the resource itself. And so that's what I'm trying to play with a bit in my data. And so I created this research question of what is the relationship between materials design and how they are mobilized by the teacher and students within the ecological framework of one 9th grade Spanish immersion social studies class. And I purposefully use the term mobilized throughout this work because I believe that it adds a description that the material is being used, but also recognizing this use is informed by different knowledges that the teachers and students bring to the interaction. It also acknowledges their experiences as actors, as individual actors, and as actors mediated by the sociohistoric context. And so that's why I'm using material mobilization rather than use to add that extra dimension into my definition. And so I conducted a qualitative case study where I was in a 9th grade social studies Spanish immersion classroom. The class had 26 students, and the teacher, who I'm calling Hannah, is a white non-native Spanish speaker, and she has 5 years of teaching experience, 3 of which are at this school in immersion. Her first 2 years were not as an immersion teacher. It's also important to point out that this was a one-to-one technology classroom, and so all of the students had iPads. And obviously there's a lot of literature into how engaging with an iPad and technology is different than pen and paper. I'm kind of throwing that to the side for these materials because the iPads were, I argue, used as though it was pen and paper. All of the materials were PDFs that were simply uploaded and then downloaded and written on. And so I'm not sure that iPad made that much of a difference in terms of how these materials were mobilized. I conducted 18 classroom observations over 7 weeks, and I audio and video recorded the lessons, took field notes. I interviewed Hannah and worked with her, talked with her informally after most of the classes. And I also collected artifacts and student work when they turned it in to her. One issue with the iPads is she often did not get work turned in when she asked them to submit it. But for the data analysis, I went through 4 distinct stages of analysis, and part of that was because this was exploratory, and I haven't found other work that really looked at data in this way, and so it took me a little bit to land on what was working for me. I first coded the designs of the materials using some of these concepts I've already talked about, and I did a qualitative thematic coding of the lessons themselves, trying to figure out some codes for mobilization. But I realized that wasn't allowing me to really look for themes across the materials because each lesson had a different kind of material. They weren't repeated or used over the course of the time that I was there. And so I created a design component framework that I'll talk about in a second that allowed me to categorize these materials and then pick some representative materials on which I did a closer focal analysis of those lessons to argue that they're representative of other lessons and other materials within that same category. And so my framework looks like this, and the y-axis, up and down, first represents the degree to which the responsibility for guiding the instructional activity can be distributed between the material and the teacher. And I'm arguing that some of the materials designs contain components that cue either a higher or lower degree of teacher responsibility for guiding the instructional activity. Remember, this is the design components. It's not how it was actually used yet. And then the x-axis is looking at that student-material interaction. I'm still playing a little bit with what I mean by this. I definitely mean physical interaction of writing, turning over a material, showing that material to a partner. I'm trying to play with if I also mean some type of cognitive interaction of organizing content to put it onto the material, but I'm having a little trouble figuring out exactly how that might work for me. But so in general, there were 3 different types of materials, and I argue that the readings cued both a low degree of student material interaction and a low degree of teacher responsibility for guiding that instructional task. The PowerPoints were a little bit higher on the level of teacher responsibility, but still very low for the students in terms of interaction. And then finally, the worksheets were a little bit more all over the place, but many of them had a high degree of student material interaction and a low degree of teacher responsibility. And I'll get to why that is in a moment. So I'm going to focus on two types of materials, and we'll start with the PowerPoints. I'm going to run through this pretty quickly, I think, in order to have time to get to the material that's on your handout. And so these are examples of the types of slides that the students saw and that the teacher used when working with PowerPoints. And there are a couple key design elements that I want to point out. The first being that red text that was used on several of the PowerPoint slide decks. And so automatically I argue that cues that text is important, right? And so that in some ways lowers the teacher's responsibility because the slide itself already tells students what's important. And then on the other slide, we also see the use of bullet points. And so the bullet points are a certain cue in comparison to full sentences on one of the slides. I argue that the use of full sentences will lower the teacher's responsibility because there's a lot of context within a sentence versus bullet points, which sort of cue the teacher to be adding more information rather than just reading off a slide, reading off that sentence. And so if we look at how these PowerPoints were mobilized, first by the teacher, she referred to the PowerPoint lessons as note-taking, and she did this both for me in the interview and also to the students themselves. And she explicitly directed the students to copy from the PowerPoints, and when there was text in red, to only copy the text in red. And so her mobilization really was a type of note-taking that she was asking the students to do, but it was a very explicit type of note-taking. And she very much performed the genre of PowerPoint in which she saw this teaching, these lessons, as presentation and not conversation, right? And there was a specific sequence in which this happened where a new slide would be on the screen. She would call on a student to read the entire text. The teacher would say thank you. And then she would verbally interact with that material by either paraphrasing, summarizing, repeating sometimes directly from the material, or adding new information. And so I struggle a little bit with how to talk about this. I'm changing my thoughts even this week after having some conversations with my professors. But I'm starting to see that she's doing two things kind of at the same time as she's mobilizing these PowerPoints. On one hand, she's offloading the content authority onto the PowerPoint by telling the students they only need to copy and even only copy what's in red. But on the other hand, she is including this contextual information. And so she appears to be employing two different notions of note-taking, one in which students will learn through copying, and one in which her contextual information will maybe give them some cues or hooks to remember as they go back and look at those notes at another time. What's interesting then, though, is how the students mobilized the PowerPoint, which maybe unsurprisingly, they copied word for word from the text, or the text in red. And so as you can see in this student example, even not knowing what those slides looked like, they have copied the exact bullet points down those slides exactly as they were. And so these notes become what I'm calling a personalized artifact that then takes on that content authority. So the authority moves from the PowerPoint to the student's notes, but it's important to note that the teacher never gets inserted into that movement, that nothing that she said showed up on any of the student data that I had. And so regardless of what the intent of her mobilization, the student's mobilization was cued very strongly by those cues on the PowerPoint that they needed to copy the bullet points or the text on the PowerPoint. So I want to turn now to the second material because it's a little bit more complex. And you have this material in front of you, either in Spanish or in English. And so I want to give you just 1 second to quickly look at the material. I'll give you 30 seconds maybe so that you have some understanding of what's going on with this material itself, and then I'll talk you through it as well. I should say the Spanish was what was given to the students. I did a rough translation into English for the sake of folks who don't speak Spanish. And this material Hannah trans-created from a student worksheet, meaning she made this material in a Word document, but much of it comes from a student workbook. But some of the language she changed. So those of you who speak Spanish might be able to tell that some of the Spanish is a little bit funky. But I won't be discussing that today. So there's several key design features of this material that I want to draw your attention to. First, I argue that this material, the design of the material, takes on much of the instructional responsibility, the responsibility for guiding the instructional activity. And this is because there are explicit instructions throughout the material. I even like the use of the word now. You see I think in item 3 on the front page, so it's even guiding the students through time as they work through the material itself. And then if we look at a couple sections in particular, and these are the sections I include that star to help you understand where I'm talking about. And these 3 items on the front page, there are a couple things that I thought were really interesting. First of all, I think that the text of the material speaks at the student by using the informal pronoun tú instead of usted. And this kind of creates an intimate conversation potentially between the material and the student in the way that the material sets up these questions. And in the way that it sort of cues certain activities, like rank these items. Now, what did you reflect on as you ranked them? One could argue that there was a sort of relationship set up there. Second, I think that this intimacy was magnified by the fact that the text on the material references the teacher in the third person, right? And so this relegates Hannah as an outsider between this teacher-student relationship, material-student relationship, when it says the teacher will do X, Y, or Z. Moreover, the teacher in Spanish is in the masculine form maestro instead of the feminine form maestra, and Hannah's a female teacher. So it's interesting that she did type this herself at one point and didn't change that word, but you'll notice in how she mobilized it that actually comes up. But I argue that given the classroom ecology, that further creates this distance between the teacher and this material-student relationship. And then finally, similarly, those 2 items, number 2 and 3, say the teacher will give you situation 1, the teacher will give you situation 2, but those situations are on the second page of that material, and they were not in the original student workbook. So Hannah added those situations onto the material when she transcreated it. But I argue that even further distances her and takes away her instructional responsibility because a student who is curious or has some agency can just slide on the iPad to the next page and doesn't need the teacher at all to accomplish the tasks of this material. So to summarize real quickly, the 3 key things are this use of the tú to speak at the student, the fact that the material takes up responsibility for guiding the activity, and then this positioning of Hannah outside of what I'm calling this material world that's created. And so when Hannah mobilized this material, there was sort of a macro and a micro mobilization. On the macro, in general, throughout this whole lesson, she was reasserting her responsibility for guiding the instructional activity. And the way that she did this is that she walked the students through the material step by step. She had it projected on the board, while the students all had it on their iPads, and she talked them through each step of the material, which may or may not have been necessary based on the cues that are on the material itself. But then in a micro sense, I noticed some rapid shifting between offloading content authority onto the material and trying to sort of take up instructional authority. And I'll show you what I mean by that in an excerpt on the next slide. But essentially that she would read from the material to allow the material, or giving the material some authority of directing the activity, and then try to add in other information or rephrase it. And it kind of became this dance between Hannah and the material and the students. And so we see this here on the next slide. I'm going to read the English just for the sake of the audience, but the Spanish is the original, right? And so in this case, Hannah's talking about the second item on the first page. And so she says, and turns back to the screen. Number 2 says, so that gives the instructional authority to number 2 on the material, your teacher, and she reads teacher wrong, or reads it as it is with the masculine, corrects herself, in this case teacher, will give you situation 1. And so I thought this was really interesting because she picked up the grammatical error for the classroom reality. It's not a grammatical error, but for the reality of the classroom, but then continued to speak in the third person about herself, allowing the material to continue to direct that instructional responsibility. So then she reads from the material, classify the articles together based on the situation, and then she says, okay, we can all read the situation together, it's on the next page. And so then she's reasserting herself into this we of the classroom space, directs the students to look on the next page, reads the situation out loud, and then does one moment of instruction. And this is her own instruction, right? Recognizing the students might not know one of the vocabulary words, but then goes back and reads the sentence again from the material before finally at the end doing a quick summary of how they need to rank each of these items. And so I really saw this as a dance because she was even physically moving between the screen and the classroom as she allowed the material to take up instructional authority or gave instructional authority to the material and then tried to give other instructions herself. At the end of this excerpt, Hannah gave the students a turn-in talk that was not included on the material, asking them to compare their rankings. And it's important, I think, to note that the students didn't participate actively in this activity or any of the turn-in talks that she included in relation to this material. But it's impossible to know whether that's because it wasn't cued on the material or if there's other factors in the classroom. And then when we look at how the students mobilized the material, many of them, well, actually, let me first say, I was only able to collect responses of those who turned in the work, right? And so for this material, I got 12 of 26 students' work. And so there could have been a self-selection bias of who actually wanted to turn in their work. They didn't know it was coming to me, per se. It was being turned in to the teacher, but that's what they got. And in general, the students followed the cues of the material. They completed the table. They wrote responses when they were cued to. On that back part with the big paragraphs, they wrote their paragraphs. But what I think is interesting is the type of responses that they wrote. And so most of them did position themselves directly into this scenario created by the material. And one example of this is a student who wrote, in response to this item number 2 of rank them again, did your ranking change? Why? And she wrote, I want salt the most because it's going to help me conserve water and survive. I want gold the least because it doesn't give anything. You don't need gold to live. And so she's really imagining herself in this space that's been created by the material. And this is in contrast to another student who fully positioned herself in the classroom world. And she did this by responding, when asked what factors she considered, she said, I thought about what we had learned yesterday, that they exchanged gold for salt because it was more important, and this would better help me survive because it's like a desert there. And so she is using this material as an opportunity to show her knowledge and maintain within the classroom world, other than the majority of the students who really, it wasn't like they were performing for the teacher. It was like they were responding to the material about why they did what they did. And she was a bit of an outlier in that sense. And you even see that in the paragraphs that they wrote on the back when they were supposed to write as though they were the characters. Quite a few of them did do that and even use some pragmatic language, writing as though they were the characters, compared to her, who wrote in the third person about the character, performing her knowledge. And so there was some contrast, but most of the students, I would say, really responded to the cues of the material directly as they were invited to do so. And so to kind of think about where do we go from here with all this information, my goal was to try to generate what I'm calling a local theory of design and mobilization for this classroom, as if, or maybe because I'm going to work with this teacher in the future to redesign her materials, what have I learned from this process? And I've just very recently come up with a framework that I think might help me think about this, which is the idea of modes of engagement and looking at what a student or teacher does in the transactions with a particular resource, and specifically how do they read the material? What are they reading for? And so looking at what they're reading for and who they are as a reader when they're looking at this material, and if I can parse that out from their mobilization. And so I'm starting to think that in general, both the teacher and students appear to read the material for the activity rather than reading it for conceptual ideas or for other things. I'm not quite sure what those things might be yet. And I also noticed that there's really a dynamic tension between the teacher in particular and the material, and this distribution of content or responsibility for the instructional activity. And Worsh, in his writing on Vygotsky, asked us to think about who is actually carrying out the action. Is it the teacher carrying out the action, or is it the material carrying out the action? And I would argue for this second handout that it really is much more complex than one might think, that material really is carrying out a lot of the action in relationship to the student of how this lesson progressed and what the students did. And then finally, I noted that the students do appear to follow the materials cues more regularly than they follow the teacher's cues. And that's not a great thing for the classroom, but that might be a great thing for me if I'm going to redesign their materials. But I think that they were strongly socialized with an understanding of what pedagogical materials are and what they are for. And so if they're given a handout, they do the handout. If they're shown a PowerPoint, they copy the PowerPoint. And that may be built into their 9 years of schooling. It may have been the 4 months before I entered this classroom that was the socialization of this classroom. It's hard to know. But so thinking then about these DLI materials and where I might go from here, I really think that who the teacher is as a reader of the materials is going to become fundamental. And the stance towards the materials is influenced by their view about the subject, about the teaching, about the role of materials and how it can support instruction. And this could be problematic for immersion teachers who view themselves as content teachers. It might be hard to get them to shift that stance, who they are as a reader, if they're going to read the material for the content activity or the content information rather than the language. But, however, given that in this classroom the teacher and students both read the materials for these activity cues, I see that there might be some potential for language-focused modifications that are built into those activity cues that the teachers and students might just take those up in the same way that I think that they were taking up the cues that were already designed in the materials themselves. So we'll see where it goes from there. And thank you so much for listening to my talk. And I welcome your thoughts and questions. Kate?
So I'm curious about your use of the concept of interaction. I know you said you've been grappling with that.
Yeah.
And so, would you mind going back to the slide
with the framework?
Yeah. The diagram, classification of the materials. Yeah. So I'm looking at the PowerPoint with low degree of student material interaction, and I'm wondering about the fact that students actually read them aloud and were asked to sort of take notes from that, and how that ended up being a low degree of interaction for you.
Well, and remember that this is the design cues themselves. So the students reading them out loud doesn't tie into this at all. What was the second thing? The taking notes. Yeah. Well, I have read some theorizing on PowerPoints. I mentioned that, and I think it's really fascinating and helps us think about what we do as educators. But that much of that theorizing has said that PowerPoint, the way that we think of it with bullet points, is a passive activity for the student, that they are just taking, and whether they're taking notes, they're taking in information rather than interacting with that. And particularly with the PowerPoint itself, that they're not even, they're not talking back to the PowerPoint. They might ask a question about the PowerPoint, and that would change it for sure. There were three and I should say it's not PowerPoint in general. It's like as we think about PowerPoints with these bullet points. Like you could put a referential question on a PowerPoint, and it would change that interaction greatly. Right. But the representation of the task that is on these PowerPoints is a very passive task. So that's how I thought about that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that is a difficult concept of interaction, especially when you think about reading, because there's a lot of research that says that reading is actually an interactive. You're interacting with the text as you're reading. You're interacting indirectly with the author of the text when you're reading.
Yes.
And so it's a tricky concept, and
yeah, I agree. And the reading, I was intentionally ignoring everything you just said, which I knew I would get pushback on.
I'm trying to push back. I just am agreeing with you.
Yeah.
This is a difficult concept, and maybe a different concept, maybe something other than interaction might be something to think about.
Yeah, and if anyone has ideas, I'd welcome them. For the reading in particular, I am thinking, I'm not sure if this works, but I'm trying to parse the idea of what is in the text versus the fact that there's text there. And so like a text and the design of a text having the words, to me, cues the low student material interaction because they are being cued to read. The actual act of reading itself has a lot of interaction. If the text is very dense, there's going to be a lot of cognitive work going on. But compared to, say, a table or a Venn diagram, it's a different type of like physical interaction. If that text then had, comprehension questions in the column, or even like if there was an instruction on it that told students to highlight or whatever it might be, that would change that completely. But that's what I'm trying to do. I know it's a little tenuous, yeah. Martha?
One of the things that struck me, I'm really familiar with Corey's work, so I've heard a few iterations of this, but one of the things that struck me this time is thinking about cueing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering about theorizing cueing through like attention awareness and noticing literature. Because, you know, it's either like attracting, you know, student attention to, you know, to do different things, or like attracting, directing, I don't know. How do you theorize cueing? Like, what do you, I just don't recall in your work.
I don't think I do. It's just a verb I'm using.
Like if you think you should or could, or I don't know.
Another way I was thinking from a more discourse analysis perspective is what the teacher is doing is sort of shifting her footing.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So you could also draw from classic work there.
Yeah. At the very beginning, I was looking at framing with Gumpers, and then I didn't think I was going to do a discourse analysis, so I moved away, and then yeah.
The field of pragmatics, there are some research of literature review documenting noticing, but that received great critique on how you measure noticing, how you understanding, like in this moment in the interaction, in the discourse, or in the conversation, that people notice certain conversational cues. So, scholars such as like has a long-term work on noticing, but yeah, still not quite yet down to the conclusion.
Yeah.
I'm also fairly familiar with your work, but one of the things that struck me was I know you in projecting forward into future iterations of redesign of materials, you're thinking about integrating language cues, right? Like cues to think about language and learn language. It occurred to me to wonder if you have thought at all about physical mobilization cues, right? You talked about how the iPads were used as paper, and we've talked about the tension of using mobilization in a context where there's not a lot of mobility, right? But there's a lot of potential for mobility. So have you thought in your plans for redesign about doing anything interesting and mobile and interactive with these digital tools that can be carried and walked around the space, or I don't know, have you thought about that?
No, I've not. But that's interesting. Yeah, no, because in coming at this design work, and I think I've said this to some of my peers, that and it might be naive of me, but I've been trying to come at it from the sense of what if I were a publisher and I wanted to actually produce better materials, what could I do in these materials themselves? And so in that sense, what you're talking about then really is how would those materials be mobilized? And so it's a slightly different question, so I hadn't thought about it. Yeah. It's interesting though. Yeah.
So I'm wondering about students' language use and how the materials prompt some of that. So my understanding is from having interacted with you about this that students use English a lot in class. The teacher uses Spanish a lot and the student using English a lot, although not with these materials.
Well, they hardly talked at all with these materials.
No, but I mean in terms of the writing.
Oh yes, they wrote in
they were
Spanish.
producing
Yep.
Spanish.
Yep.
So have you thought about that at all? In ways in which the material itself could get them to stay in Spanish?
I have not made that connection that they were writing in Spanish and speaking in English, just because I'd moved so far away from thinking about their language. So that's a really great idea. No, I've not thought about it, but I think that there could be something there. My hope was if you get them if you include the language cues that get them thinking about language metalinguistically, would that then cue them to stay in Spanish because they're talking about language? But the written component is really interesting. Yeah. Go ahead, Kendall.
Just thinking of, I find it sort of pressing that nothing that the teacher said was included in any of the students' outline.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense that that's because they're just tuned in to the copying there, or if it's kind of linked to what Dee said, that they're not their oral, kind of listening and speaking is so weak, or?
I attribute it mostly to the instructional paradigm that it was communicated to them that this was what was going to be important. And the teacher, it was interesting, for some of the PowerPoints, her oral language came from the side of the room. She would stand on the side of the room and kind of talk across the room. And it really felt to me like she was just talking well to hold time while the students were copying. In talking with Sam about it a little bit more, he gave me some more optimistic thought that like she was maybe trying to place these hooks for them to remember context when they went back to reading it. But to me, at the moment, it really felt just like, so there wouldn't be silence, I'm talking. Yeah.
To what degree are they really attending to what she's saying if they're so focused
Well,
on copying
yeah.
what's on the PowerPoint?
I would argue they were hardly attending. And there were a couple moments, literally a couple, where they would ask questions about content on the PowerPoint. I can't think of a moment where they asked a question about content that she was saying. And she would sometimes she would throw out a question as part of this talk, and there would usually be silence, or maybe like a yes, no, kind of mumbled, and then she would continue. Yeah.
She defined note-taking as copying from PowerPoint.
Right.
Why would they do anything more?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, if they were looking for those contextual cues on the hooks, I would expect to see those hooks also in the
Right.
that's how I would do it.
Yeah.
That was a book that I wanted to go back to.
Yeah.
It's the star that the teacher said this is really important.
We also have to remember that they're ninth graders, right? And at ninth grade, students are still often being taught how to do note taking. They might not know to do those.
The teacher would have to say, "This is important. Write this down."
Right.
To really get the kids to diverge from what's on the screen.
Mm-hmm. Except even you think about like the way that we use PowerPoints, where who knows if it works or not, but where we all have things fly in, so you don't have all the text at once. You can have one bullet point and talk about it, and then have another bullet point, and she wasn't doing that, right? It was all there, and then she was going to talk about it. Yeah. Martha, did you have?
The number 2 thing about tu maestro.
Yeah.
And then I wasn't sure exactly what happened. So it's masculine here, but she's actually talking about herself, so she switches it to feminine, and then she switches it back to masculine.
No, then because she continues to read from the slide or from the paper itself, she keeps that verb in the third person, right? So she says, número 2 dice tu maestro, en este caso maestra, te dará la situación. And so she acknowledges that she's a woman, so this material should say maestra, but then she's going to keep talking about herself in the third person.
What do you make of that? Like, why does that happen?
I make of it that she has strongly offloaded the instructional authority onto the material, and so it just makes sense to allow the instructional authority to stay in that space rather than to try to, in her mind, like rather than taking it back up.
Because she already went to the trouble of like figuring this handout out from the other materials.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But then like doesn't make it her own.
Right.
To me, it shows kind of it's not like something just between her and the students. It's like it's just us here. So
right.
She could even say you instead of
yeah. Exactly. I thought that was really interesting. And that's where that gets into Worsh's question at the end of who's doing the action, that she even made the material to be able to continue doing the action rather than, and I think to me it was this idea of her reading the material for activities. She saw that workbook, she saw the activities, she put the activities into a Word document. Russ, did you have a thought about that?
Yeah, I was thinking, so did she impact would that have on the classroom ecology if the teacher isn't important, integral part of some other one of the participants? Could that have negative consequences, you think? Or is it a positive or neutral?
Yeah, so Brown writes, I'm going to answer your question kind of, I'm going to pivot just a little bit, but Brown, when he writes about teachers offloading, improvising around materials, and then adapting. And he argues that it's not necessarily a quick thing of like you offload because you're a bad teacher, or offloading is a bad thing. Like sometimes we do these things to create certain instructional paradigms, and sometimes we do them for other ones. And so for this material, did it create a bad classroom ecology? I don't know. The students did what they were supposed to do. Do I think it was really a worthwhile instructional activity? That's kind of a different question. But it wasn't like this for all materials, right? Like there were other materials where, well, she would still offload quite a bit. I wouldn't say that the students saw her as unimportant. Like she still had authority in the classroom. They still cared about their grades. There were other factors at play. So it doesn't quite answer your question, but I think it's a little bit more nuanced than just saying that distance means a poor classroom ecology or something like that. Yeah.
So I think this is probably a good time to stop. We've gone past time.
Yeah.
So we want to thank Corey for such an interesting.
Thank you all so much. I want to highlight the word, should I ignore? I'm going to keep talking while she's going because I've got a lot I want us to get through. But I want to highlight that the phrase representation of is really key, right? That the material itself is not the task, the material itself is not the concept, but it represents it and cues it to then be happening within the space. Okay. That's okay. On you the next slide. We can think about how I just said I need the next slide. In a bit I'll be talking about PowerPoints and how they constrain our ability to actually present information. I was thinking about that as I was making my PowerPoint too, that you feed into it as you do it. Okay. That should be fine. Yeah, because then when we click, that goes live, right? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay.